The low-cost carrier Skylark Air departed Barcelona en route to Hamburg. On board were 152 passengers, including families returning from vacations, business travelers, and a handful of students on a school trip. The crew was a seasoned team of 6, with Captain Eric Jansen at the helm. Jansen was a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience. Beside him, as first officer, sat Dario Klein, a quieter, more reserved man in his early 30s. The flight was routine as they climbed to cruising altitude. The skies were clear, and the gentle hum of the engines lulled many passengers into a sense of serenity. The cabin crew moved through the aisles, serving beverages and snacks, their smiles masking the weariness of a long day. In row 14, Clara Stenberg flipped through her journal. A journalist, she had just wrapped up an assignment documenting the struggles of displaced communities. She felt a sense of accomplishment and a longing for home. Across the aisle, Luis Ortega, a software developer, meticulously sketched an idea for a new app on the back of a napkin. He had promised his wife he'd slow down on work this year, but couldn't resist the thrill of innovation. But not everyone shared this calm. Dario, seated in the cockpit, checked the instrument panel obsessively. His colleagues noted that he had seemed tense during the pre-flight briefing, muttering under his breath as if rehearsing something. Yet, outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. Dario Klein had always been a perfectionist, from his days as a flight school standout to his steady rise through the ranks. He pursued control with an intensity that unsettled those closest to him. On the surface, he was a model pilot, cautious, thorough, dependable. But beneath that exterior was a man haunted by a growing darkness. The investigation would later uncover fragments of his life. Medical records, emails, and unsent letters that painted a picture of a man unraveling. He had taken time off from work just a year prior, citing burnout, though the real reason was a bout of severe depression. Reports from his physician showed that Dario had resumed flying against medical advice. To those who knew him, the signs were subtle but there. His once vibrant social life had dwindled. His conversations became clipped, and his eyes carried a tired, haunted look. He had started canceling plans, skipping meals, and retreating into the solitude of his apartment. A week before the flight, his landlord had reported hearing shouting from Dario's unit late at night, followed by silence. When asked later, the landlord admitted he had dismissed it as another fight with himself. Dario's one-sided arguments with the demons he never shared with others. On the morning of March 10th, Dario had spent hours alone, browsing his laptop. His search history included articles about mental health, the mechanics of aircraft systems, and, chillingly, detailed information on how to lock the cockpit door from the inside. At the airport, he smiled at his colleagues as he always did. No one noticed the slight tremor in his hands or the distant look in his eyes as he boarded the plane. At 38,000 feet, life inside Skylark Flight 3756 unfolded like a microcosm of the world below. Strangers shared polite nods, families spoke in hushed tones, and the occasional burst of laughter broke through the steady hum of the engines. In seat 22B sat Sophia and Marcus Lenz, a couple celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary with a romantic getaway in Barcelona. They held hands, Sophia resting her head on Marcus's shoulder as they flipped through photos on her phone. The images captured the bliss of a sun-soaked week that felt like a much-needed reset in their busy lives. 3 rows ahead, Matteo Ricci, a wiry man in his 40s, wore noise-canceling headphones and tapped furiously on his laptop. A financial consultant, Matteo was racing against a deadline, aware that his company's success hinged on the presentation he would give in Hamburg the following morning. In the last row, near the galley, teenagers Clara and Jonas shared earbuds, giggling at a TikTok video on Clara's phone. Their class trip to Barcelona had been a whirlwind of museums, paella, and beach outings. They were already texting friends back home about the adventures they'd had. Some passengers were wrapped up in personal joys, others preoccupied with work or fleeting distractions. None of them had any reason to think their flight was anything but a straightforward journey home. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Dario Klein glanced at Captain Jansen, who was busy coordinating with air traffic control. The steady voice of the captain crackled through the radio as he charted their path across Europe. Dario stared at the controls, his fingers flexing nervously. Below the surface of routine, cracks were forming, though no one on board could yet feel the fissures widening. Dario Klein had become adept at masking his turmoil. Years of practice had honed a facade so convincing that even those closest to him never suspected the depths of his despair. But in the solitude of the cockpit, with only the hum of instruments and the occasional crackle of radio communication, his mask began to slip. Captain Eric Jansen, a steadfast presence in the airline, had always considered himself a mentor to younger pilots. He prided himself on creating an atmosphere of trust in the cockpit. Dario had always seemed like the ideal co-pilot, serious, respectful, and methodical. But even Eric couldn't sense the storm brewing in the man seated next to him. As Eric stepped out to use the restroom, Dario's hand hovered over the cockpit controls. He took a deep breath and engaged the cockpit door lock. Standard procedure, but his heart raced as he turned the switch. It clicked into place with a finality that made his stomach churn. Dario glanced at the overhead panel, his eyes tracing every dial and switch, as if committing the scene to memory. He thought about his years of training, the camaraderie with colleagues, and the awe he once felt for the miracle of flight. Yet, all of it now felt like a faint echo, drowned out by an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The investigation would later reveal that Dario had struggled with the weight of failure, real and perceived, his entire life. His medical records, hidden from his employer, showed a history of severe depression, exacerbated by a recent breakup and a string of personal disappointments. The void within him had grown too vast, and now, in the cold, clinical surroundings of the cockpit, he believed he had found a way to end it all while making his pain impossible to ignore. As the captain returned, Dario's hands trembled, but his expression remained impassive. They exchanged routine updates about their route and weather conditions. Nothing seemed amiss. Eric sat back in his seat, adjusting his headset, unaware of the silent resolve crystallizing in his co-pilot's mind. At 10:15 a.m., Skylark Flight 3756 was cruising at 38,000 feet, its trajectory steady and uneventful. The captain excused himself again, this time for a brief chat with the cabin crew. He left the cockpit with the same casual confidence he always carried. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing Dario inside. Moments later, the cockpit door lock engaged fully. The indicator outside turned red, signaling the door was now secure, a feature designed to prevent hijackings. Inside, Dario's breath quickened as he stared at the instruments before him. His reflection in the cockpit window stared back, a ghostly image superimposed on the endless blue sky. The cabin crew moved up and down the aisles, attending to passengers. Drinks were served, questions answered. In seat 7F, Clara Stenberg had just started writing a journal entry, recounting her trip's highlights. Further back, Matteo Ricci had finally closed his laptop, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. He glanced out the window at the Alps below, their jagged peaks cutting into a clear sky. The calm was shattered moments later when Captain Jansen tried to re-enter the cockpit. He swiped his access card, then entered the code into the keypad. The lock didn't disengage. Puzzled, he repeated the sequence, only to be met with the same unyielding red light. Dario, Eric's voice came through the intercom, calm but questioning. Can you unlock the door? Inside, Dario didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the altimeter as his hand adjusted the autopilot settings. The plane began a gradual descent, a shift so subtle that passengers and crew didn't immediately notice. Dario, Eric tried again, his voice sharper now. He banged on the door. This isn't funny. Open up. The flight attendants nearby exchanged worried glances. One tried the emergency code, but the override had been disabled. The realization hit the captain like a gut punch. He was locked out, and Dario wasn't responding. In the cabin, the subtle descent became noticeable. The engines shifted pitch, and passengers began murmuring. The flight attendants moved quickly to reassure them, though the tension in their faces betrayed a growing unease. Inside the cockpit, Dario's grip tightened on the controls. His jaw clenched as he stared ahead at the horizon, now tilting toward the unforgiving peaks below. At 10:20 a.m., the descent became more pronounced. Skylark Flight 3756, once gliding serenely at cruising altitude, was now hurtling toward the Alps at an alarming rate. The cockpit remained silent except for the automated warnings from the aircraft systems. Sync rate. Pull up. Terrain ahead. Outside the locked door, Captain Jansen pounded relentlessly. His normally composed demeanor had given way to desperation as he shouted, "Dario, answer me. What are you doing?" His fists thudded against the metal, the sound echoing through the narrow corridor. A flight attendant rushed to him, her face pale. "Captain, what's happening?" "I don't know," Eric snapped, though his mind was racing with grim possibilities. He knew the systems inside the cockpit better than anyone, knew that unless Dario reversed the lock or a miracle occurred, there was no way in. In the cabin, the unease spread like wildfire. Matteo Ricci felt his stomach lurch as the plane tilted further, the sensation unmistakable now. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, trying to peer down the aisle toward the cockpit. "Is everything okay?" he called out, his voice tense. Other passengers began looking around, their expressions shifting from curiosity to fear. Sophia and Marcus Lenz clutched each other tightly in row 22, their whispered reassurances failing to mask their growing terror. In the back row, Clara and Jonas exchanged wide-eyed glances. Jonas tried to keep his friend calm, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. "It's probably just turbulence," he stammered, though he didn't believe it. Meanwhile, Dario sat motionless, his hands steady on the controls. He had deactivated the autopilot and was guiding the plane manually now. His expression was calm, eerily so. The cockpit alarms blared, warning of imminent danger, but he ignored them all. His thoughts churned, though his actions remained deliberate. He thought of the missed opportunities in his life, the relationships he'd pushed away, the weight of expectations he could never meet. This, he told himself, was the ultimate way to take control, to leave a mark. Behind the door, Captain Jansen grabbed an emergency axe from the galley, his determination fueled by adrenaline. He swung it against the reinforced cockpit door with all his strength, the clang reverberating through the cabin. The passengers screamed at the noise, the chaos overtaking the once quiet flight. In the midst of it all, Clara Stenberg scribbled a final note in her journal, her hand shaking but resolute. "If this is the end, I want my family to know I love them. I'm sorry I won't make it home." At 10:25 a.m., Skylark Flight 3756 continued its inexorable descent, now dangerously low, skimming just above the jagged peaks of the Alps. The cockpit's automated warnings grew more frantic. "Pull up! Pull up! Terrain ahead!" Outside, Captain Jansen was drenched in sweat, his muscles burning with every swing of the emergency axe. The reinforced door barely yielded, each strike leaving only a faint dent. Behind him, the lead flight attendant tried desperately to calm the passengers, whose collective panic was now spiraling out of control. In row 14, Clara and Jonas clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces as they whispered prayers they barely remembered. Matteo Ricci's hands trembled as he gripped his laptop, its glowing screen forgotten. Sophia and Marcus Lenz held each other tightly, their whispered words lost in the chaos. Inside the cockpit, Dario remained focused, his hands firm on the controls. But cracks were forming in his resolve. The warnings around him, the distant echoes of the captain's desperate cries, the faint sobs he imagined beyond the sealed door, all pressed against his psyche like a vice. His gaze drifted to a small photograph taped beside the instrument panel, a photo of himself, smiling with a woman he'd loved years ago. Her name was Emily, and for a brief time, she had been his anchor, his reason to keep going. But Emily was gone, another casualty of his spiral into despair. Dario's breath hitched as memories surfaced. The nights spent alone, the relentless weight of his perceived failures, and the silent battles he had fought every single day. And now, in this moment of calculated control, he found himself questioning it all. But the pull of the abyss was strong, too strong. Captain Jansen's voice cut through the intercom, louder now, cracking with emotion. Dario, please. Whatever's happening, we can fix it. Together. Just open the door. Dario's fingers twitched on the controls. He closed his eyes, the weight of Jansen's words pressing into him. Fix it? Together? For the first time, doubt pierced the fog that had consumed him. In the cabin, Clara Stenberg scribbled her final words. Matteo Ricci gripped his armrest, his mind racing through regrets and unspoken apologies. Marcus Lenz kissed Sophia's forehead, his voice breaking as he whispered, I love you. The plane dropped lower, the mountains now terrifyingly close. The Airbus A320 roared through the cold alpine air, its descent now unmistakable to all aboard. Snow-dusted peaks grew larger in the windows, a stark reminder of the inevitable. The cabin was chaos, screams, prayers, and sobs intermingling as passengers clung to loved ones or whispered final words. Captain Jansen had exhausted himself, trying to breach the door. He stood panting, his hands bloody from gripping the axe too tightly, his body trembling with desperation. He pressed his face against the door, speaking softly now, a last attempt to reach the man on the other side. Dario, he said, his voice breaking, I know it hurts. I know what it feels like to want to disappear. But this isn't the way. These people, he gestured weakly behind him, though Dario couldn't see. They trust us. They need us. Please don't do this. Inside the cockpit, Dario's grip tightened. His breathing was shallow, his heart pounding against his ribcage. His mind felt split. One part urging him to complete his dark plan, the other screaming at him to stop. Outside, the terrain proximity alarm shrieked relentlessly. Terrain. Pull up. Pull up. Dario's gaze flicked to the altimeter, then to the photo of Emily. He thought of her laugh, her gentle encouragement during his darkest days. He thought of the passengers behind the door, their lives, their dreams, their families waiting for them to come home. His hand hovered over the controls. The mountains loomed closer, their peaks like jagged teeth against the horizon. In the cabin, Clara Stenberg closed her journal, clutching it tightly to her chest. Matteo Ricci muttered a desperate apology to no one in particular, tears streaming down his face. Sophia and Marcus held each other as tightly as they could, their love unspoken but understood. At 10:27 a.m., the plane skimmed perilously close to a ridge. Captain Jansen screamed into the intercom one last time. Dario, you can stop this. The plane shuddered violently, the engines straining as they neared their final moments. Dario's hand hovered over the thrust lever, his vision blurred with tears. Then, in a single motion, he made his choice. At 10:28 a.m., Skylark Flight 3756 was just seconds from the inevitable. The cockpit warning screamed with unrelenting urgency. Terrain, pull up, pull up. Passengers clung to each other, their cries a cacophony of desperation. In the cockpit, Dario Klein's trembling hand finally moved, but not toward the controls. Instead, it reached for the small photograph of Emily, his fingers brushing its edge as tears streamed down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. But outside the cockpit, Captain Jansen refused to surrender. His bloodied fists hammered one last time against the unyielding door. A flight attendant grabbed his arm, pulling him back as the plane's nose dropped further. The first impact came swiftly. The left wing clipped a jagged peak, sending a deafening jolt through the cabin. Overhead compartments burst open, luggage and debris scattering as passengers screamed. The Airbus shuddered violently, losing a section of its wing as it spiraled downward. In row 14, Clara Stenberg clutched her journal as the world turned upside down. Matteo Ricci's laptop flew from his lap, smashing against the ceiling as he braced himself against his seat. Sophia and Marcus held each other tightly, their final moments spent locked in an embrace. Inside the cockpit, Dario closed his eyes as the mountains rushed up to meet them. The plane plummeted into the jagged terrain, its fuselage crumpling upon impact. Fire and metal consumed the serene alpine valley in an instant. leaving a scar across the snow-covered landscape. By 10:29 a.m., Skylark Flight 3756 had disappeared from radar. The once pristine valley was now a scene of devastation. Charred wreckage strewn across jagged rocks, wisps of smoke rising into the thin alpine air. The only sounds were the wind and the distant crackle of cooling metal. In the days that followed, search and rescue teams combed through the wreckage, their bright uniforms stark against the blackened snow. There were no survivors. Among the scattered debris, they found items that told fragments of stories. Sophia and Marcus's wedding rings fused together, Clara's journal with her final words of love and apology, Mateo's shattered laptop, its screen still flickering faintly. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered, its contents chilling. Investigators pieced together the haunting final minutes. Captain Jansen's desperate pleas, the pounding on the door, the crescendo of alarms. And then, Dario Klein's voice, barely audible, whispering, "I'm sorry." The investigation unearthed Dario's struggles. A man consumed by his own demons, spiraling into a darkness he could no longer escape. The tragedy sparked global outrage and prompted calls for changes in cockpit security protocols. But for the families of the 152 souls lost, these measures came too late. In Hamburg, Clara Stenberg's family received her journal. Though its pages were singed, her final message survived. "I love you all. Be kind. Be brave." In the valley where the plane had struck, the air was heavy with sorrow. A makeshift memorial of flowers and photos grew near the crash site, a reminder of lives lost too soon. The mountain stood silently, bearing witness to a moment that would echo in the memories of those left behind. Though the wreckage would eventually be cleared, the scars, both on the land and in the hearts of the grieving, would remain forever.